Hi, Taj. Welcome to my channel, and thank you for joining me to discuss your soon-to-be released book, Come What May, We're Here to Stay, which was published by Manchester University Press. And it's a real pleasure to be in conversation with you and to give some background to the audience. Taj is a journalist and a historian. His work has appeared in several mainstream newspapers, including The Guardian, The Huffington Post, and The Independent. He is a former editor of Tribune magazine and a finalist for the Orwell Prize 2026, which is great news. Congratulations, Taj. And your book, Come What May, offers a really powerful and timely exploration, I think, of South Asian resistance, anti-racist organizing, and political activism in Britain. And at a time when discussions about race and Islamophobia, migration, and identity are still dominating public debate, this book reminds us that these conversations did not begin yesterday and that there is a deep-rooted history. And rather than telling the story of South Asians as passive victims, you have really uncovered a remarkable history of people who organized, they resisted, and fought back from anti-colonial revolutionaries and lascars to trade unionists, community activists, and the South Asian youth movements. You challenge us to rethink whose stories are included in British history and whose contributions are too often overlooked. But this book also, for me, asks really important questions around solidarity, race, class, and identity, and how the ways communities have organized over time and how it's evolved. And it draws on thought-provoking connections between the struggles of the past, but also what we are facing today. So I'm really looking forward to exploring some of the themes with you. And if I could go into the first question, it's really about you said in the beginning of the book that you were writing when the Southport riots happened, and that was in 2024. So you did include a bit in the beginning about that. And you stated that what happened there wasn't an isolated moment, but it was part of a much longer history stretching back decades. So what made you feel that this was a story that needed to be told now?
So 2024, those riots were the worst racist riots in living memory. We saw checkpoints being set up in Middlesbrough where people were being asked about their ethnicity and their race. We saw hotels housing refugees in Rotherham and Tamsworth, people literally trying to burn them down. And we saw mosques, homes, and businesses attacked. And I guess it was a different experience depending on who you were and where you were in the UK. If you lived in the northeast of England or in Merseyside or in areas where the ethnic minority communities are quite small, there was a great deal of fear. We were hearing about people having panic attacks, people taking a week off work. And so the racist violence was very out there. It was in people's faces. It was having an impact on the ground. And I guess the urgency of writing a book like mine, telling the stories of racism in the past, but how we also try to resist racism, I felt was an urgent task. What we learn from history is that the changes in society never came from people at the top. It was people organizing within communities that fought back against racist violence and, created a sense of safety in many of our large towns and cities where we have much larger ethnic minority communities. I'm talking about places like London and Birmingham and Bradford and Luton. I think we take for granted why we feel much safer than other areas of the UK. And it was because of the organising from some of our elders that led to that sense of security. And so I think it's really important at a time like this where we're seeing rising racism. There was a new report out that said a mosque in Britain is attacked every 5 days. Understanding the past will help us to try and think about how we attempt to challenge some of the big, big problems we have in the present.
Mm. And I do want to come on to that bit about Islamophobia and racism in a bit more detail. But before you touched on a really important point, and it was really obvious in the book about recurring patterns. So one of the things that was so striking was that the language and the descriptions that you give, they feel so familiar. So whether it's talk of immigration and we're having invasion from these immigrants in Britain, to discussions on who belongs, how minority communities are seen as a threat. The police racism was very strong in this. And these narratives that you give go back even to like the mid 1800s until now, we are still facing the same things. Why do you think these patterns keep resurfacing? And as you said, what can history teach us really about dealing with them?
I think when we have growing insecurity in society and we have a great deal of economic concerns in many of our working class communities, it's often convenient for the establishment to have scapegoats. And this has been a long pattern throughout history. So when we think about after the First World War, in many of the port cities where we have some of the earliest multicultural communities in Britain, I'm talking about places like Liverpool and South Shields and Cardiff, we saw racist riots targeting Black and Asian seafarers. In 1958, in parts of Nottingham and Notting Hill, again, we see rioting. In 1981, again, high levels of unemployment and urban decay in the inner cities, we again see Black and Asian people being targeted. And it's a very simple narrative that says that the government and the establishment, they care about those people over there, but they don't care about you. And yes, there are many problems that many white working class communities have faced historically and face today. But I think, the racism and the hate against people of color has often come from the top down. It's often been narratives in the media and from politicians that have led to Black and Asian people being targeted. So a great example of this is when you think about Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech in 1968. He claimed that in 15 to 20 years, the black man would have the whip hand of the white man. And he made that speech in the context of a growing Black and Asian community. Many of these people, the descendants of people who lived in the former colonies, people who were colonized. Britain colonized a quarter of the planet and often called upon people from the Commonwealth to help rebuild Britain after the Second World War. And so, as much as they wanted our labor, they did not want our presence. And Enoch Powell made that speech at a time when Sikhs, for instance, were demanding that they are allowed to wear the turban on the buses. And it was this idea that Black and Asian communities are asking for far more than they should have. They should not have these rights. And we hear the same rhetoric today around the Muslim community. We've had this debate around Sikhs having a kirpan, which is a ceremonial blade, after what happened in Southampton. We've had narratives around halal meat. 1 in 3 Brits, according to a 2018 poll, believe there are Sharia-run no-go zones in Britain. 1 in 3. And so it should be no surprise why we're seeing a rise in Islamophobia. And so the narratives in the press and from politicians have always shaped what is happening in society.
You really detail in the book the extent of South Asian activism and and the discrimination faced at a much earlier stage to just what we think of the immigration waves of the 50s and 60s. But admittedly, we don't know enough about how the South Asians led on a lot of organizing, were really active. So from the India House that you talk about and the Indian Workers Association to Grunwick, which isn't far from me, the Southall Youth Movement and the Bradford 12. Do we know enough about these activists? I presume that's one of the reasons you wrote the book. And why is it important that we record their stories?
So I was 12 years old when my teachers told me I couldn't walk into my town centre because the English Defence League were in town. And so from a very early age, as a young Muslim, we were grappling with questions of identity and belonging. And it was only because of the English Defence League and me being curious about the far right that my father told me about what it was like in the 70s when we had the National Front and what his life was like at school. And I feel amongst some of the older generation, they want to try and forget the past because it was that bad. And much of the history of anti-racism and racist violence in the 70s and 80s, it's an oral history. It's things that our parents would tell us about anecdotally, and it's not really been written down. There's a few examples of, people referencing Asian youth movements and things like that. But there are so many stories within our communities that haven't been documented, and I think that's partly because many of our parents are working class people who've always worked long hours, who've always been trying to raise a family. Many of them did not go to university. And so there's definitely a class issue here in terms of whose stories are documented and whose aren't. Some organizations were formal. Others were people simply trying to defend their roads and their local mosques. And I think they've been written out of the history books. There's also some people who reached old age and passed away, and sadly, their stories were not documented. So I felt there was an urgent task to try and preserve this history. It was useful actually when I was trying to look at the anti-colonial organizing in the early 20th century that the British state actually spied upon many of these people. And so I relied upon the India Office records in the British Library to uncover a lot of the history. So I was going through state surveillance files of these Indian students in 1905 to 1909 who were organizing for revolution, who learnt from the Irish Republicans, who built links with the Egyptian nationalists, who played a key role in the independence struggle. We like to think that it was people in what is now India and Pakistan and Bangladesh who played a role, and absolutely they did. But there was a growing diaspora at the time of the British Empire who also played a role. In fact, it was probably easier to organize for revolution and to make the argument for revolution in Britain, where we had less suppression and we didn't have these hostile laws. So, I've just captured a snapshot of that history. It's not an encyclopedia, it's not an extensive history, but even in that, there is so much material there. And as a writer, you have to pick and choose what stays and what goes. How do I make this engaging for a younger audience? And so I think there's so much more that is yet to be uncovered in this history.
Yeah, and it makes a lot of sense because even with what happened in partition, our elders in the same way don't really like to talk about it because the trauma, the pain, and there's a sense of they don't want to complain and they just want to get on with their lives and not put that on their children. But a lot of that is the pain. And you speak about the cross community solidarity that comes across really strongly. And that is something I know that there was political blackness, there was that movement, and if you were brown or black, even if you were Irish or minors, you would organize under that label, and people were working together against the oppression. But today, and I often wondered, reading your book, and I was just thinking, wow, people were really committed to this fight. And now it feels to me that these conversations are way more fragmented. There is a sense from my peers that, oh, there's progression. It's not like how it was. Whereas I see it very strong institutionally, and things like representation is there to kind of blind us in a way that there's progress. Um, and I thought it was really interesting how you referenced the race relations industry in fragmenting and causing this fracture, in your opinion. And then after that, labels that were imposed on us, these ethnic sort of breakdowns, terminology like BAME, which doesn't really represent anyone. And it's very reminiscent of divide and rule, so still colonial tactics. And I was wondering if you could expand on that a bit more.
So I think it's worth mentioning that throughout our history, and I'm talking not just in Britain, but in the Indian subcontinent, our communities were never a monolith. There were always winners and losers. There were always oppressors and the oppressed. Whether it came to the zamindars who were treating harshly the farmers on the land, whether it was the sarangs who were the people who controlled recruitment on the British ships. They were the fellow countrymen of the lascar seafarers. They often cheated them of their wages. And whether today it's, the exploitative bosses that are paying South Asians, particularly the first generation migrants, very very low wages. There's always been an oppressor and an oppressed. And so I think the history is not always so black and white. And so I think in order to understand some of these divisions within the different communities, I think we really do have to understand how we became fragmented as people. If you think about what it was like in the early 20th century, we were campaigning for independence. Whether you're Muslim, Sikh, or Hindu, you wanted independence. And even Savarkar, who is seen as a founding ideologue of the contemporary Hindu far right, there's evidence during his time in London where he was actually working with Muslims and Sikhs. And so these divisions came much later on. But when you think about political blackness as a concept, which really emerges during the post-war period, it's about uniting different groups. It's about practicality, that we were victims of empire, that we are victims of racism in Britain, and that we have to find a way to unite. And there's so many examples of the African Caribbean organizations and the South Asian organizations, though they may have organized autonomously within their communities, they saw the importance of trying to build bridges and unite. They were a small minority in Britain. The Asian youth movements, yes, they were called the Asian Youth Movement, but they organized as working class people. They saw the importance of building bridges, for instance, with the white working class mining communities. We saw during Grunwick the support of the white working class during that important dispute. And so, these people were building bridges between different communities. And then what you start to see in the late 80s after the 81 riots is that racism and anti-racism, the conversation moves away from the streets, away from where the working class communities live, and we start to see, jobs being created to tackle racism, where you now have state funding in the picture. And what starts to happen is some people abandon their more radical principles because they're thinking about receiving state funding. People are starting to compete over funding. So you have money being put into a community, and you have the African Caribbean community competing for the same pot of funding against the Bangladeshi and the Pakistani communities. And this has created a great degree of resentment between different ethnic minority communities, and it still exists today. I think we became divided along religious lines as well. We can't simply just blame the British state. I think events in the Indian subcontinent, when you think about some of those communal divisions that started to emerge, they had a real impact in Britain as well. I also believe that the Saudi petrodollars backed Wahhabi interpretation of Islam has created a more fundamentalist Islam. It's not a majority view, but it certainly had growing influence. And that's meant people are identifying as Muslim and only Muslim. Of course, some people will be proud Muslims and they will use Muslim identity in the context of growing Islamophobia. If you're attacked as a Muslim, you'll defend yourself as a Muslim. But what I've seen in communities, and all of our communities are guilty of it, it's not about pick or choose between one ethnic group or one religion, is we have become divided amongst each other. Solidarity is seen as a transactional thing. When Sikhs were being targeted in hate crime recently in Southampton, I heard from Muslims who were saying things like, well, the Sikhs support Tommy Robinson, so why should we support them? And it's that kind of mindset amongst, sadly, I have to say, a younger generation, which is causing real divisions and lasting damage. And I don't want to glamorize the past because there were always disputes and arguments and disagreements between different groups. But there was, in general, a far greater sense of unity. People could see past religious divides, past communal divides, and they could unite in the shared struggle against colonialism and racism.
Hmm. So the Wahhabi rise of Wahhabism that you talk about, that was the time when I was at university or a bit before, and I felt it just really negatively impacted my experience. So that really resonates. But if I could just ask you a bit more about the divides that have been created now. And I get that in the beginning, there's this urgency to get rid of the colonial empire. And so people were united in let's just get rid of them. But then and then nationalism came. And I think that bred a lot of division as well and resentment between people because they're then fighting each India, Pakistan, and then you got the creation of Bangladesh in 71, but beyond in other ex-colonies as well. And then the government here, and it feels like to me that the race relations legislation, they started to introduce more of it. And it feels like to me it was because of rioting and they maybe didn't, they wanted to follow a US model, like you mentioned in the book, of containing communities. We have stronger equality laws, so you won't see now that level, although I feel like it's reversing, but that level of like far right um National Front kind of racism now, at least in places like you said, London, where there's more ethnic minorities. But there is still so much of this racism and Islamophobia still, and it just takes a little thing for it to come out again. So what has anything changed? And do we, has anything changed? And what do we need to do in order to effect change?
So I think racism and the way it operates has certainly changed. Nowadays, you'll have people like Tommy Robinson who will proudly say he doesn't mind African Caribbean people, he doesn't mind Hindus and Sikhs, he just hates Muslims. Proudly talk about the fact that he's not a racist. They are ashamed by the label of racism. We still have ethno-nationalists. We still have people who are just clear cut and open about their racism. But you've got this growing mainstreaming of racism, which says, look, we don't have a problem with people based on the color of their skin. We have a problem with them based on their religion. And so Islamophobia as a form of racism has really been in the ascendancy. And of course, Islamophobia is not a theological dispute on religion. It's about people being attacked because they are perceived to be different. So some of the first victims of Islamophobia were the Sikh community because many of the men wear a turban, and so they are racialized and treated as different. We've also seen, temples and gurdwaras being attacked, people thinking they are mosques. So that's the logic and justification of the racism. They also have new tools in their arsenal. So nowadays, we used to have in the anti-racist movement this thing about, no platform, that we're not going to let the far right sell their newspapers and spread their poison in our communities. And there were fierce battles over this in East London between many of the anti-racist organizations. Well, how do you tackle that when the racism is on your phone or it's on your television or the richest man in the world who controls one of the most influential social media platforms is regularly amplifying the rhetoric of Tommy Robinson? In 2009, when Tommy Robinson set up the EDL, he was a local loudmouth. He set it up in an abandoned warehouse. He never had those international connections. And so the far right has become more international. It's very savvy with technology. I think again, I referenced this earlier, it depends on who you are as well. So a Muslim woman who wears a headscarf is far more likely to be targeted in an Islamophobic hate crime. And so, as much as I said, we might feel a sense of security, even in diverse communities, we hear regularly stories of Muslim women, being abused on public transport, or when they go for a holiday or something like that, they're being targeted. And so, we talk about race relations legislation and things like that. But I think it was really and truly the organizing activity of the anti-racist movements that played the biggest role in pushing back against the far right. It was because communities came out and said, we are going to physically defend our homes and our businesses and our places of worship, that the far right were pushed off the streets. And they've made a frightening comeback on the streets. And I think what's different this time is we don't have the same degree of anti-racist organizations. We do have many anti-racist organizations, we have many NGOs, but they lack the links with working class communities. And I think this is one of the big problems. Who's doing the work of monitoring far right attacks? Who's doing the work of supporting victims of racist attacks? We can have huge demonstrations in central London asserting our anti-racist values, and we've seen some of those recently. But if a Muslim woman in Sunderland or Essex is being targeted, where is the anti-racist movement? And so I think there's a lot of work that we can be doing as communities. And I think if you do have that sense of privilege, whether it's a gendered privilege, whether it's a geographical privilege, whether it's a class privilege, I think it's important to try and support those communities that don't have that benefit. First generation migrants who can't really speak English, who aren't so familiar with the law, who's doing the work to support them? Who's doing the work to support those more isolated communities? So a very good example of this is in East London, you can get on a train and you can go to Basildon in Essex and you speak to the Muslim women there. They have a totally different experience as a Muslim in Britain. And I think it's not that difficult for people in parts of London to build the solidarity with those more isolated communities.
So that was one of the things that you just said about that there's no support in the anti-racist movement. So there's a couple of questions within that. Um, so one is about Islamophobia, and the relationship between racism and Islamophobia. And you talk about like the Rushdie affair, Barbary Mosque being demolished, and that was in the 80s. But we know that Islamophobia or anti-Muslim discrimination existed before that, because you describe incidents specifically like anti-Muslim tactics such as throwing pigs' heads. How would you know that? Throwing pigs' heads at mosques. So you obviously know a bit about Muslims, and they did know. British people did know. We had a lot of interaction, the West with the Muslim world. But then, so you draw specifically, so those races drew specifically on anti-Muslim symbolism rather than like basing it on people, the color of people's skin in some instances, and then using the term racist, using the term Paki. and and then that would involve attack because they were ignorant, so they would attack Sikhs and Hindus, and like you said, Sikhs are often victims being confused as being Muslim. So how do you understand that relationship? Where do racism and Islamophobia overlap? Uh, so you have like anti-racist movements now and trade unions that want to stay secular. So when incidents of Islamophobia come up, I've experienced this myself, they don't want to support. And I've heard other people of diverse backgrounds saying, also having Islamophobic views now, and or saying, or a Sikh or a Hindu person will say, I'm not a Paki, or I'm not Muslim. I don't want to be called Asian anymore because we don't want to be linked. Um, and then you mentioned Jaya Ben Desai from the Grunwick dispute. I thought that was a really interesting example because I've learnt about her when there's plaques up and everything. But she supported, or she was part of a Hindu nationalist group and was quite in favor of the Barbary Masjid and it being demolished. So I find these two, racism, Islamophobia, sometimes I get the racialization of communities, but then in the institutions now, if you say there's racism as a Muslim and there's Islamophobia, it kind of gets swept under the carpet. So I just wondered what you thought about that.
Well, I've heard quite a few Muslims say this to me, and often when I'm in an anti-racist meeting, I'm often the only one who brings up Islamophobia, and I sometimes wonder what that conversation would look like if I was not in the room. And so I think there's this tendency to think we can just, group everyone together and say it's a shared experience when it really isn't. You mentioned other ethnic groups being Islamophobic. There's many, many examples of that, both in Britain but also internationally. You only have to look at what's currently happening in India, where you've got people being mobbed, lynch mobs attacking people, and all sorts happening around the world. To understand the global dimensions of Islamophobia, there was always this sense of a clash of civilizations, and colonialism itself was seen as, a civilizing mission that we have to civilize the savages. And so, as you said, Islamophobia does have those long and historic roots. And it's interesting when I see people of color playing into far right narratives or trying to be the good immigrant and say, I'm not like these people, I'm different. It always comes for them. Racism always comes for them. Sometimes it might be delayed. You look at Zia Yusuf in the Reform Party, he regularly provides legitimacy to racist narratives. And then you see some of the hardcore support base regularly attacking him because he has a Muslim name. And
Yeah,
so it
exactly.
is a problem. And I think for whatever reason, maybe it's because they don't understand what Islamophobia actually means. There is a hesitancy amongst people to address it, to talk about it. And what I've also seen, including from some who were involved in the anti-racist movement in the 70s and 80s, is a failure to call it out.
Yeah.
There were a couple of people that I spoke to who were active in the 80s, who were involved in South Asian women's activism, who later started regularly talking about Muslims being backwards on gender.
Mm.
And yes, all of our communities have had problems in the past. It wasn't, by the way, just the Muslim
Yeah,
community.
it's not exclusive to just Muslims. There's
But
patriarchy here as well.
yeah,
Yeah.
and they will refuse to call out Islamophobia. They'll say by having a definition of Islamophobia, you're going to prevent a critique of Islam and Muslims. And I've always said it's not about the theology, it's about people being attacked because they are perceived to be Muslim.
And also, not just physical attacks, we see it very much institutionalized, which is
Muslim
not,
sounding names, for example, is a very
yeah.
good example of this.
Also, if you want to set up a Muslim forum,
Mhm.
or you want to display a Muslim cultural side of your heritage at a culture day, it's seen as suspicious. And no, you have to choose a country because Muslim is problematic. And I just wanted to just say, finally, if there was anything, like if you could tell us more when the book's coming out, what are the main takeaways that you would like readers to get from it?
Yeah, the book is out on the 15th of September. I'm going to be doing a full book tour. We've got 18 events lined up. So I encourage people to come to those events. We're going to have people that were actually involved in some of these movements talking about their own stories in their own words at some of these events. What I'd like people to take from the book is inspiration and also to do something about it. Don't just read the history, understand that you also have a role to play in shaping the future. It's only because many of the people I interviewed for my book took the initiative to organize that things changed. You can't wait for things to get worse before you start to act. And so I don't think the past is a perfect blueprint for the present, but I think there's many, many lessons that we can learn. There's many errors and mistakes that were also made that we can learn from too. One of my greatest inspirations is Malcolm X. I never met the man. He died before I was born, but his autobiography changed my life. It gave me confidence. It allowed me to understand how we combat Islamophobia in the present. And I think that's the powerful thing about history and reading books is they can really inspire you. They can, put fire in your belly and make the changes that you want to see. Malcolm X visited Britain on four separate occasions. His visit to Smethwick after the most racist election in British history was described as a shot in the arm of the anti-racist struggle by the Indian Workers Association. And the other lesson here is we cannot fight racism in silos. We have to build bridges between communities. We have to organize together. This is one of the biggest challenges our communities face is this retreat into what I consider, toxic identity politics, where we are constantly competing with other groups instead of trying to figure out what unites us and how we can work pragmatically together. We are divided amongst each other, and it's only when we unite and we organize together that we'll be able to win.
Thank you so much. What you said about, I saw an interview where you mentioned Malcolm X's book. You read it at 13. I think I read it at the same time. My mum gave it to me. Um, and it's life changing. Um, Also, we need to, I think what came across is we have certain selected elite leaders that are used to liaise on our behalf with people who in power, and we need to get back to grassroots. I really picked up on that. Your book is thoroughly inspirational. It has given me that spark in my belly, and I really encourage people to go out and buy it and to read it. And it's been amazing speaking to you, Taj. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.